Chapter 58. The following morning, D.C. Beth Mays sat at her desk in the office above Coleshaw Police Station, puzzled and concerned. She had just filed her report on the arrest of another 2 members of the notorious Bates family for their involvement in a vicious armed robbery. With the criminals now safely in police custody and the report filed, Beth looked at the other matter awaiting her attention. It was worrying and strange. Jan Hamlin, the tenant in Ivy Cottage, had reported intruders in her garden again. But last night, ignoring advice to stay indoors, she had gone to investigate and had seen a van leaving Coleshaw Woods. She had noted the registration number and had told the officer she believed the owner was somehow linked to the intruders coming onto her property. Uniform had run the registration number through the police computer and had identified the owner, but that was as far as they'd got last night. The matter had been passed to Beth, and she was struggling to understand exactly what it meant. Anne Long was the registered owner of the van, the same Anne Long midwife Beth had interviewed in connection with missing babies. While the previous inquiry was closed, there'd been a satisfactory explanation. Whatever had Anne been doing in Coleshaw Woods late at night in the middle of winter? And on many other occasions, if Jan Hamlin was to be believed. According to Miss Hamlin, she had heard Anne calling some creatures that were getting into the garden and terrorizing her. She had refused to accept they could be foxes or badgers, and was so distressed by what she'd seen that she'd given notice on her tenancy agreement and was ready to leave. When Matt had previously visited her, he'd said she didn't seem hysterical or given to flights of fantasy, and it seemed that something was getting into the garden. Perhaps there was a rational explanation for all of this, Beth thought, but what it could be escaped her. She glanced at the office clock. It was 11:30 a.m., and she'd been working since 5 a.m., up since 4 a.m. for the raid on the Bates house. Time to go home. And on the way she'd stop off and visit Anne Long. Closing down her computer, Beth took her jacket from the back of her chair and crossed the near-empty office. There were only a few officers in on a Saturday. She left the building by the back exit where the cars were kept and got into the unmarked police car assigned to her. Mulling over possible scenarios for Anne being in the woods, Beth drove up the high street, heading in the direction of Melton. Some of the shop windows were already decorated for Christmas, but Beth's thoughts didn't mirror their festiveness. There was something disquieting about Anne Long being in the woods late at night, following the previous investigation into missing babies. She had dearly hoped she was wrong, but Anne wouldn't be the first nurse to suffer from psychosis and use her position to do harm rather than good to others. Beth gave the Christmas trees standing in the market square at Melton a cursory glance as she drove past, and then, with a growing sense of unease, turned into Dell's Lane. Her sat-nav showed that number 45 was at the far end on the right. There was no van parked on the driveway, nor any sign of the other car registered to Anne, a grey Vauxhall Corsa. Perhaps one of them was in the garage. It wasn't large enough to take 2 vehicles. Beth got out and glanced at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and storms were forecast for the weekend. She rang the doorbell to number 45 and waited. No one answered. She tried again, knocked on the door, then looked through the letterbox, but a security hood blocked her view. She returned up the drive and then went next door to number 43. A woman in a dressing gown answered the bell. "Sorry to trouble you. Detective Constable Beth Mays," Beth said, showing her ID. "There's nothing to worry about. But do you know when your neighbour Anne Long will be at home? I'd like to talk to her as part of a routine inquiry." "If she's not there, she's most likely at work. She's a midwife and doesn't keep regular hours. If she's late back, she goes straight out again to walk her dogs. Someone else was asking about her, and my husband told him the same thing." Who? Do you know? No, just said he was a friend of hers. And Anne keeps dogs? Yeah, dangerous ones. They have to be kept on a tight leash. She can only take them out at night when there's no one else around. Goodness knows why she bothers with them. I wouldn't go to all that trouble. No, indeed, Beth said. That's very helpful. Do you know what breed of dog they are? No, never seen them. We stay well away. You could try phoning her mobile, she added helpfully. Do you have her number? Yes, I do. Does Anne have a Navy van here? Yes. It'll be in the garage if she's at work. She uses it when she takes the dogs out, which keeps her other car nice for work. Thank you, Beth said, and returned to her car. The mystery was solved. Anne had dangerous dogs and sensibly walked them at night when there was no one else around. It made sense. But that wasn't the end of it. The Dangerous Dogs Act made it illegal for any dog, regardless of its breed, to be out of control, which clearly Anne's were. It must have been the dogs that had been going into the garden of Ivy Cottage and terrorising the tenant. Anne would need to be spoken to and warned that in future her dogs had to be kept on a lead in any public space. However, that wasn't a matter for CID, and Beth would pass it back to uniform to deal with. Satisfied, she headed for home as large drops of rain began splattering on the windscreen. Chapter 59. Ian sat at the dining table, staring at his laptop, angry and upset. He was at home, and Emma had gone to her mother's for the day, which was just as well, for he was struggling to hide his feelings. He wouldn't have believed what Anne had told him had he not seen David with his own eyes. Atavism. When DNA from our evolutionary past reappeared in the present generation. He'd been reading about it on the internet. It happened naturally sometimes when a gene mutated, but in David's case, it was because of Carsten Moller's obsessive need to continue his line. How dare he mess with people's lives? The arrogance of the man. How much Edie Moller knew, Anne hadn't been sure, but felt she probably knew and turned a blind eye to what he was doing. Ian hadn't told Emma what he'd discovered, and he wouldn't. He'd said he'd seen Anne, and she'd confirmed that errors had occurred at the Moller clinic, resulting in too many patients sharing the same donor and babies not surviving. It was all Emma needed to know, now or in the future. They'd agreed that soon they'd have to start making plans to separate, for now they knew they were half brother and sister, a future together was impossible. Ian's anger flared again. Moller had played with the lives of his patients, manipulating and deceiving them for years for his own ends. He had told Anne he had stopped, but Ian wasn't so sure. There'd been no evidence of other donors in the files he'd seen. Ian needed to be certain his evil practice had stopped for good, but in a way that didn't expose David or others like him that might follow. Ian thought he knew how. He was studying Moller's files on his laptop, not those relating to his patients, but his accounts, including tax returns, which it seemed Edie Moller had been responsible for. The accounts were in a mess, much like her other filing, but it was clear that the Mollers hadn't made huge sums from the clinic. But then that was probably part of his strategy, Ian thought. Keep the fees low to attract as many clients as possible so he could spread his genes far afield. Ian was aware that the quickest, most efficient way to close down a business was as a result of tax evasion and money laundering. HM Revenue and Customs were fast and relentless in their pursuit of offenders. He set to work. Posing as Moller, Ian began raising capital online, using Moller's business and house as collateral. It was ridiculously easy on the internet, with no face-to-face interview. he electronically signed documents and raised as much as he was allowed from various banks and loan companies. It had increased the clinic's income tenfold, on paper at least, and Ian then introduced 2 fictitious employees. It was a scam firms used to reduce their tax bill. Illegal, of course, but it added another layer of fraud to Moller's accounts. Ian then set up 5 offshore accounts in countries that were notorious for tax evasion and money laundering. He'd seen similar on clients' computers and knew how they worked. Ian spent a productive hour transferring money out of Muller's UK accounts and in and out of the various offshore accounts, backdating some of the transactions so it appeared he'd been up to no good for years. Working in information technology at Weatherby Security had taught Ian a lot, and by the time he finished, Muller's accounts shouted money laundering and tax evasion to even the most inexperienced clerk. But just to make sure they weren't missed, and to get an investigation going quickly, he emailed the police fraud department and revenue and customs anonymously, whistleblowing on Muller. Last but not least, Ian sent an email from Castor Muller to all his current patients and those whose parents had been treated at the clinic. It informed them that there'd been a dreadful mistake at the clinic, and if they were planning on starting a family, they should have their DNA tested as a matter of urgency, as it was possible they might share the same biological father as their partner. All Ian could do now was watch and wait. He didn't have to wait long. Almost immediately, patients began emailing Muller expressing their shock and concern, and asking for more details about the exact nature of the error that had occurred, and if they should be worried. Yes, Ian replied on Muller's behalf, you should be very worried indeed. Get checked straight away. Some asked where they could be tested, and Ian sent them details of the firm he had used, mygenetichistory.com. The emails continued to arrive, and Ian wondered what Muller was making of it, or perhaps he didn't check emails on a Saturday. Enjoying the weekend off, for there was no reply from him. Was he in for a shock on Monday morning? An email arrived from Grant and Chelsea Ryan, threatening to sue Muller for every penny he had got, which wouldn't be a lot by the time the fraud squad and HMRC had finished with him, Ian thought with satisfaction. Now heavily mortgaged and with huge debts, Muller would be bankrupt once the fraud squad got hold of him. Sweet revenge. Ian was destroying Muller's life just as he had destroyed his and Emma's, and all the others he'd deceived. Muller had played God and lost. Chapter 60. Jan stood to the right of the living room window, partially secreted behind the curtain, and stared into the night. The rain had stopped, but the sky was dark as fresh storm clouds gathered. She was still hoping the creatures would return. The motion sensor light outside was off, and she had her phone ready. One final chance to get the film she so desperately needed before Camille arrived. But the opportunity was quickly receding. It was after 8 p.m. now, and Camille would be here before long. She texted from the airport to say her plane had landed, and she should be with her by 8:30, depending on the traffic. Jan had taken up her position at the window as soon as night had fallen, waiting and hoping they might come early. She was already packed, and her cases were in the car. Just her coat and handbag remained in the cottage. She'd gone into the village earlier and brought some basic food items for Camille, and flowers to say thank you and sorry, which she'd put in a vase on the coffee table. She'd said goodbye to Lillian, who hadn't appeared surprised to hear she was leaving. Camille had told Chris, who'd told his brother, who'd passed it on to Lillian. That's how news travelled in the village, a grapevine of conversations as efficient as email or text. Jan shifted position and continued to keep watch. Surprisingly, Camille had already found another tenant who would move in as soon as Jan had left, which eased Jan's conscience. Camille was coming back to oversee the changeover, spend a few days with her family in Tinder, and then return to her job abroad. Heaven help the new tenant, Jan thought. They would need to be made of strong stuff to live here. Nothing would have enticed her to stay. Jan had arranged to lodge with her mother for a few weeks, while she applied for jobs and looked for a flat to rent. She would also spend a weekend with Ruby and catch up with other friends she'd neglected while she'd been here. Maybe even make a proper start on that book she was supposed to be writing. She had a few ideas, but if she could get a film or photograph, she would also write a feature article about the creatures in the woods. Newspapers and magazines were always keen to buy pieces about the weird and supernatural. The front doorbell rang, and Tinder shot off the sofa and ran to the front door barking. Jan came out from where she'd been standing and switched on the living room light. Tinder would be as pleased to see Camille as she was, she thought, and opened the door. It wasn't Camille, but Chris. "I wanted to say goodbye," he said, and handed her a box of chocolates. "Oh, okay, thanks," she said awkwardly. She hadn't expected to see him again. "Do you want to come in?" she offered, feeling she should. "Camille will be here soon." "Yes, if I'm not disturbing you." She stood aside to let him in, and he headed to the living room. "You've got the curtains open," he remarked. "I didn't think you liked seeing the dark." She shrugged. "I'm getting better. I've had to, living here. Do you want a drink?" she asked, putting the chocolates on the table. "Yes, please. Scotch? Thanks." Chris sat in his usual armchair, and Tinder went to him. Jan poured his drink and handed it to him. "Aren't you joining me?" he asked. "No, I'll be driving soon." She sat on the sofa, her back to the open curtains, as Chris took a sip of his drink. This would be her last chance to challenge him about the video he'd removed from her phone, for as soon as Camille arrived, she would leave. She took a breath and looked at him. "Chris, why did you delete the video from my phone?" A brief flash of discomposure, and then he recovered. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. "The video clip I took of what was coming into the garden, I showed you, then left my phone down here while I went upstairs to let Tinder out of the bedroom. After you'd gone, I'd found it had been erased. You knew that was the only proof I had." He briefly met her gaze, but his look was guarded. "I remember you showing me the video, but that's all. Perhaps I accidentally deleted it." She was about to say that was highly unlikely when the doorbell rang again. Tinder shot down the hall. "That'll be Camille," Chris said. "Yes, I know," Jan said tartly, and went to answer the door. "Hi, we meet at last," Camille said warmly, coming in. She hugged Jan and then petted Tinder as he jumped up at her excitedly. The likeness between her and Chris that Jan had seen in the photographs was even more obvious in person. "Welcome home," Jan said. "Chris is here." "Yes, I saw his car outside. I texted him to say I was on my way back." Setting her case down in the hall, Camille went through to the living room with Tinder, close behind her. Jan followed. "Hi, love," Chris said, and he stood to greet her. They hugged with great affection. "I could do with one of those," Camille said, referring to Chris's scotch. "I'm knackered after all the travelling." "How do you like it?" Jan asked. "Same as Chris, please." Jan went into the kitchen and poured the scotch, feeling slightly uncomfortable at playing hostess in what was Camille's home again. Returning to the living room, she handed her the glass. "Thank you so much," she said appreciatively. "Those flowers are gorgeous. Don't forget to take them with you." "They're for you," Jan replied. I put them in water to stop them from wilting." "That is kind." Camille seemed as pleasant in person as she had been in her emails, and Jan couldn't help but like her. "I've put bread and milk in the fridge," Jan said, "and I've topped up the meter. The spare change is in its usual place in the cupboard under the stairs, and here are the front door keys." She placed them on the coffee table and prepared to leave. "Thank you," Camille said. "Sorry I couldn't get here earlier. You've got a long journey. Why don't you stay tonight and then drive home tomorrow?" "I'll be fine," Jan said, and instinctively glanced towards the open curtains. Camille followed her gaze. "I'm sorry you've had problems with the creatures from the woods coming in. They wouldn't have harmed you, but it must have been annoying just the same." "Chris doesn't believe they exist," Jan said, and waited for their reaction. Camille sipped her drink while Chris concentrated on his glass. Neither of them spoke. "Goodbye then. Thanks for everything," Jan said, and she picked up her handbag. "I'll see you to your car," Chris said. "There's no need. I'll just say goodbye to Tinder before I go." Jan went to stroke him, but as she did, he let out a low, threatening growl. She instinctively stepped back. Still growling, he gave a bark and ran to the patio window. Jan's heart missed a beat. It wasn't her he was growling at. He'd heard something. Were they out there? Had they come after all? It was the time they often came. Chris and Camille were looking at the window too. "I'll close the curtains," Camille said and stood. But as she crossed the room, a face appeared at the glass. Jan let out a small cry and delved into her bag for her phone. Too late. The face had gone. She rushed to the back door with Tinder at her heels and opened it. He ran down the garden barking, and Jan caught a glimpse of the shadowy figure before it disappeared through the hedge and was gone. Chapter 61. With blood pounding in her ears, Jan returned to the living room, her phone still in her hand. She looked at Camille and Chris. Neither of them spoke. Camille continued to the windows and purposely drew the curtains. Chris concentrated on his glass of scotch. Jan looked from one to the other. Were they planning on ignoring what had just happened? The silence was deafening. "Well?" Jan asked after a moment. Camille returned to her chair and looked at her. "Do you still have any photographs or film of them?" she asked. "No, Chris saw to that," Jan said sharply. "But you're surely not going to deny they exist?" "No," Camille said quietly. "Sit down, Jan. We need to talk. Are you sure you don't want a drink?" "Perfectly." Jan sat on the sofa, upright with her bag still on her shoulder, ready to make a run for it if necessary. She didn't feel safe with the two of them alone in the cottage. They were clearly colluding, and the air was charged with secrecy and foreboding. Perhaps she should leave now while she had the chance, but then she'd never know what was really going on. "You obviously want an explanation," Camille said, and took a sip of her drink. "I will explain, but first you must promise never to tell anyone. Young lives could be lost if you did." "I want to hear what's happening first before I make any promises," Jan said, her voice unsteady. "I doubt anyone would believe me anyway without proof." Camille glanced at Chris, who nodded, confirming it was all right for her to continue. "It won't have escaped your notice that Chris and I look alike," Camille began. Jan nodded. "We're related. We share the same biological father. We're half-brother and sister." Jan gasped. "I know, although we didn't know it when we began our relationship. We assumed our likeness was the result of our genes being messed up by the power station's chemical waste getting into the water supply. There are others in the villages around here who look alike, and everyone believes the power station is to blame. It was only after we'd been in a relationship for some years and had a child that we discovered the truth. Camille paused to take another sip of her drink. Jan saw her hand shake as she set the glass on the table. Chris was looking at her. Our baby was born very different to how nature intended, Camille continued. He was a genetic throwback and didn't live long. It was only by chance we discovered the truth after we saw someone in the garden here and gave chase. It was late at night and pitch black, but we found Anne in the woods, locking what looked like a child into the back of her van. Chris blocked her path and demanded to know what was going on. She broke down and told us. Some children, including our son, were being born with a genetic condition, not because of the power station, but because our parents had received the same donor sperm from the local fertility clinic. Chris and I were obviously appalled, angry and upset, and wanted the man responsible arrested. Anne said he was no longer practicing. She had seen to that, but begged us not to go to the police, as it would jeopardize the safety of the little ones still being born. Outsiders, she calls them. After much soul-searching, we agreed to keep quiet and do what we could to help Anne. Chris and I couldn't continue our relationship, as we're half brother and sister, so we parted, but have remained friends. Camille stopped, her eyes glistening with tears. Jan looked from her to Chris and didn't know what to say. Was she telling the truth? She could see pain in his eyes too. Our son only lived 10 days, Camille said, but others with this condition have lived much longer, some for years. They mature quickly, not like human babies. There is a baby and 2 toddlers alive at present. The ones you've been seeing. When you met Anne with Chris, they were trying to work out how to stop them coming into the garden here. Anne keeps them in her house all day, away from prying eyes. Then at night, she takes them into the woods for some exercise. The woods are thickest at the back of the cottage, so it's reasonably safe. There's nowhere else for them to go around here. Some years back, a woman heard a baby cry. She reported it to the police, but they searched the area and thankfully found nothing. But as you have discovered, they can be very mischievous, undoing your hedge repair and teasing you by moving a ball of twine. They mean no harm. Usually they're wary of strangers. They would probably have lost interest had you not started leaving food out. Anne feeds them well, but they can't resist tempting treats. I'm sorry, Jan found herself saying. It's not your fault. I now realize it was a stupid idea to rent out the cottage. Chris warned me there might be problems, but I wanted to take the contract abroad and I needed someone to look after Tinder. I really didn't think they would bother you. They know me well, but I thought they would stay clear of a stranger, which, according to Chris, they did at first. Jan nodded. Then it seems they got braver and braver as they got used to you. I switched off the motion sensor light upstairs just in case they came to explore, but you turned it on again and saw them. Sorry, Jan said again. I'm not blaming you. They obviously felt safe and knew you wouldn't harm them. Well, not in a physical sense. But of course, what they can't appreciate is that they would be harmed dreadfully if news of their existence got out. Anne has tried to tell them, but they don't understand. They're only children. Camille stopped. That's it, really. Jan took a moment before she spoke. Did she believe them? Yes. I knew something weird was going on, but never in a million years would I have guessed what it was. What happens now? We continue as we have been. Who else knows about them? Jan asked. Until recently, just Chris, myself and Anne, But Ian Jennings, a father to one of them, has found out and is taking steps to close the clinic permanently. He can be trusted. He understands no one must ever find out, as I hope you do. Does Lillian know? Jan asked, looking at Chris. No, he replied. She and my brother believe our child was stillborn, and that's what broke up Camille and me. No one can know, for the sake of these little ones, and those like them who haven't been born yet. There will be others? Jan asked, horrified. There will be, until all those who have been affected have stopped having children. Ian is contacting them all now. And what will happen to those children who haven't been born yet? Jan asked. Some will die straight away, Camille said sadly, and Anne will look after those who survive. Chris, Ian and I will do what we can to help. Jan nodded solemnly. It was an incredible story, and if she hadn't seen the children herself, she would never have believed it. But she accepted the explanation she'd been given. Anne won't be able to take them into the woods when your new tenant is here, Jan said. It'll be too risky. Anne is my new tenant, Camille replied. It makes sense to have her live here, in the middle of nowhere, without fear of being discovered. When I return from my contract abroad, I will help look after them. Anne will be able to spend time in her own house again, without the constant worry of being found out. How did Anne get involved? Jan asked. As a midwife, she was seeing and hearing of children being born with the condition. She became suspicious and started asking about the history. She discovered that all the grandparents of the babies had used the same fertility clinic. Jan nodded. These babies are born a lot earlier than human babies. Some are stillborn, but others can survive. Instead of leaving them to die, Anne began taking them away and looking after them for however long they had. She's a saint in my eyes, but if anyone found out, she would be prosecuted. I dread to think what would happen to the little ones then. I won't tell anyone, Jan said. No one would believe me anyway. They fell silent for a moment, and then, glancing at Chris, Camille said, I'm sorry things didn't work out for you two. Chris is a good man. He was only trying to protect me. He was upset when you told him Tinder had got into our baby's clothes. I kept one outfit, and the rest I got rid of. Those clothes belong to your baby? Jan asked. Yes. I'm sorry. I had no idea. I put them back carefully and made sure that Tinder never went in there again. Thank you, Camille said. They're all I have to remember him by. There was silence again, and then Jan said, I think I should be going now. She stood. Are you sure you won't stay the night? Camille asked. No, but be reassured your secret is safe with me. Thank you, and thanks for the flowers. I'll see you to your car, Chris said. Jan petted Tinder one last time, said goodbye to Camille, and went with Chris to the front door. Outside, the clouds had parted to reveal a full moon. Jan unlocked her car door and got in. Goodbye, Jan, Chris said, one hand on the open door. Look after yourself. I will, and you, she smiled. Perhaps once you're settled at your mother's I could text you? Yes, I'd like that. He ducked his head in and kissed her cheek. Drive carefully. I'll be in touch. Chris closed her car door. Jan started the engine and slowly pulled away. As she bumped over the uneven road surface, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Chris was standing in the middle of the lane watching her, a lone figure silhouetted against the night sky. But as she looked, she saw two small figures emerge from the woods and stand either side of him. He held their hands. Guilt enveloped Jan. She had let Chris and Camille believe their secret was safe with her, but it wasn't. Far from it. Last night, she'd given the registration number of Anne's van to the police. How long would it be before they traced her and found out what she was doing? She'd never forgive herself if she was the one who led them to being discovered. Once out of sight of Ivy Cottage, Jan pulled over. Sick with fear that it was probably already too late, she took her phone from her handbag and called Coleshaw Police Station. Chapter 62. It's Jan Hamlin. I used to be the tenant in Ivy Cottage, she said. I phoned last night and reported a prowler in Coleshaw Woods behind the cottage. Yes, I remember, the officer said. I took your call. I was on duty last night. How can I help you? I made a mistake. I gave you the registration number of a van I thought I'd seen leaving the woods, but I was wrong. No, I think it checked out. Surely not. It was a mistake. Her stomach churned. I'm certain the matter's been dealt with, but if you'd like to hold the line, I'll find out. Yes, please. Tears stung her eyes and panic gripped her. Please let him be wrong, she thought. What was she going to do if the matter had been dealt with? Say nothing and continue home, or return and alert Chris and Camille? Was there still time for Anne to escape with the children? She doubted it. Sitting there with the full moon shimmering through the trees, she could picture those strange children being captured like animals as Anne tried to protect them. Then what? A media circus. A secure hospital to be tested, analysed and experimented on, and it was all her fault. Hello, the duty officer said, coming back on the line. You were right. The lady who owned the van was traced and she has been spoken to. Spoken to? Why? Jan gasped. I was wrong. No, you weren't. She owns dangerous dogs and hasn't been keeping them under proper control. That's what's been getting onto your property. Oh, I see. She keeps dogs, Jan repeated, hardly daring to believe. Yes, an officer has spoken to her and she'll be given a formal warning in writing that they need to be kept on a leash at all times or she will be prosecuted. It's an offence not to keep dogs under control, so thank you for bringing it to our attention. We're always grateful to members of the public for helping us in our job. Thank you, Jan said, and ended the call. Relief flooded through her. Thank goodness. The police believed Anne kept dangerous dogs, so all she would receive was a written warning. She'd be free to continue her work, and those little ones could live out their short lives in her loving care. Chapter 63. 6 months later, Ian sat in his living room, dinner on a tray, watching the evening news. A for sale board had been erected at the front of the house, and Emma had already moved out. She was staying with her family until the house was sold, when they would divide the proceeds and furniture and buy a flat each of their own. Emma had taken all her personal belongings, and the house felt bare and lonely without her. Ian missed her, but they would remain friends, and eventually, he thought, they would hopefully find new partners with whom they could have healthy children. The signature tune for the 6 o'clock news began, and Ian raised the volume, anticipation coursing through his veins. Today was the day. The climax of the police investigation, which Ian had been monitoring closely throughout. He had watched, and where necessary, had given an anonymous helping hand, although the fraud squad hadn't needed much help, as Moller's guilt was obvious from all the records they'd found. The fruition of their investigation had come today at 2 p.m, when they had raided the Moller clinic and arrested Karsten and Edie Moller. Ian had taken time off work to watch it through Moller's CCTV, which he'd hacked into. The media had been there because Ian had tipped them off. Now he was looking forward to seeing their arrest on the evening news, as were others whose lives Carsten had ruined. The international news items came first: a plane crash in Siberia when no one had survived, a shooter in the US, a bombing in Thailand, and the ups and downs of the stock market. Then the home news began, and this item was first, with the presenter giving her report outside the Moller clinic. "Earlier this afternoon," she began, "this quiet rural village was left in a state of shock when a husband and wife in their 60s, purporting to be doctors, were arrested at this clinic you can see behind me. They are being detained on suspicion of deception, fraud, and money laundering." The report cut to film taken that afternoon of the Mollers being led away by detectives as reporters took photographs and shouted questions. "I never claimed to be a doctor," Moller retaliated. "But you don't deny you let patients believe you had medical qualifications when you duped them." Any reply was lost in the barrage of questions and jeers from onlookers as the Mollers were put in separate police cars and driven away. The presenter came on screen again. Carsten and Edie Moller ran a fertility clinic from their home here for decades. But instead of using donor sperm as they told their patients, they used Carsten Moller's own sperm, charging clients and growing rich on the proceeds. It is thought that Moller could have fathered thousands of children with unsuspecting victims. A despicable and cruel breach of professional trust. It's not the first case like this. There have been similar cases in the UK and abroad. Local MP Sandra Tilsley is calling for tighter legislation. A woman, who'd been standing off camera, moved into view, and the presenter pointed the microphone at her. "The whole village is dismayed and upset by what has happened here," the MP said. "Our sympathy goes to those who have fallen victim to this unscrupulous pair. I shall be calling upon the government to make changes in the law so that in future private clinics like this one are better regulated. Clearly, this is a scandal on an unprecedented scale, and it must never be allowed to happen again. If anyone thinks they may have been affected, they can contact me or telephone the number that will be shown at the end of this report." The presenter thanked her and then moved to a teenage lad Ian recognised from the village store. "What did you feel when you heard the news about the clinic?" she asked him. "I always thought there was something odd about that pair. A lot of people around here did," he said. "But you didn't suspect what they were up to?" "No, they never had much to do with us, really." She thanked him and then wound up the report with more film taken earlier, showing the police coming out of the clinic carrying computers and medical equipment. The piece ended with the helpline phone number. Satisfied, Ian switched off the television, picked up his knife and fork and continued to eat his dinner. He knew there was sufficient evidence to convict Moller without implicating Anne or giving away the existence of the outsiders she protected and cared for. Ian had seen to that. He'd removed all traces of the second-generation file from Moller's computer and had tweaked others. The great advantage of his job was that in keeping hackers out, he knew exactly how they got in and the damage they could do. Tomorrow he would visit David one last time and then try to pick up the pieces of his life. David had outlived their expectations, and Ian had seen him every week since Anne had told him. Not at her home in Dell's Lane, but at Ivy Cottage, where she now stayed. It was perfect, rural and remote, so that David, James and Keris could run free and make the most of their last days, happy and unaware they were any different from others. For that, Ian was grateful. Chapter 64. "Have you heard the news?" Beth asked the following morning as she slipped into her office chair. Matt looked up from his computer screen and frowned questioningly. You must have. The raid on the Muller Clinic. Oh, yeah, I did. You can't miss it. But why are you looking so concerned? Because we weren't part of the action. You know the fraud squad use their own people. That's not the reason, Beth said. You remember Ian Jennings? We interviewed him and his wife after their neighbour reported their baby was missing. Yes. He phoned months ago with concerns about the Muller Clinic. I took his call. He had found out that his and his wife's parents had used the clinic and they'd both been given the same donor sperm. I didn't do anything. I told him it wasn't a police matter and to contact the adjudication service responsible for the private sector. Oh, I see, Matt said. That was a missed opportunity. Has he filed a complaint? No, but I feel bad I did nothing. In my defence, Ian didn't say that Carsten Muller was their biological father, only that he'd had his and Emma's DNA tested and they shared the same donor. He probably didn't know it was Muller then. Well, he certainly does now, Beth said. It's all over the news. It must have come as a huge shock. Or possibly he was contacted as part of the investigation, Matt suggested. Maybe, Beth sighed. Even so, I feel bad. I should have done more to help him. He thought it could be the reason he and Emma weren't able to have healthy children. He wanted the clinic investigated. I was thinking maybe I should phone him and apologise. I wouldn't, Matt warned. If he does file a complaint, it could be seen as an admission of your guilt. You're probably right, Beth agreed. I'll tell the sergeant, though, just in case there are repercussions. Hopefully Muller's arrest will give Ian and Emma some closure, although I can't see their marriage surviving. That MP was right when she said private clinics need to be better monitored, otherwise it could happen again. Chapter 65. A year later, Jan was in the village store in Merryless, buying groceries. How are you feeling? Lillian asked as she scanned the items into the till. Good, now the morning sickness has stopped. Only it wasn't just in the morning, but all day. I know, Chris said, you poor dear. But at least it's past, and it will have been worth it in the end. Yes, Jan agreed. I've got to have another scan this afternoon. They think I might have my dates wrong, as the baby isn't as big as it should be. They can also determine the sex of the baby from this scan. Do you want to know its sex? Lillian asked. I guess it makes sense, Jan said, putting the items into her shopping bag. It means we can plan ahead and think about names. Lillian smiled. I'm so pleased you two got together in the end. I always thought you were well suited. I know, you said, Jan laughed. I'm pleased too. You're good for him. Any plans to marry? You sound just like my mother, Jan said. Maybe after the baby is born, but no rush. We've shown our commitment by living together. Good. Chris is a fine man. He won't let you down. I know, Jan said, paying. You must come over to supper one evening. Thanks, we'd like that. And to see the changes you've made to his house. Even Chris says it's more comfortable now, although I think he needed some persuading at first. Tell me about it, Jan laughed. Another customer approached the counter, so saying goodbye, Jan left the shop and began the walk to what was now her home. Who would have guessed she'd end up living in a village, she mused, not for the first time, surrounded by fields and a single shop and pub. And where everyone knew each other. She'd always thought of herself as a townie, but then she'd fallen in love with Chris. A week after she'd returned home, he'd texted as promised. Jan had replied, and it had gone from there. They'd started dating, and their relationship had flourished. Chris had first suggested she move in with him after they'd been going out for 4 months, as the travel was taking its toll. She'd said no to begin with, and had then agreed to a trial period. Now here she was, settled into village life, not missing the town at all, and 18 weeks pregnant. It had been a heady year, the stuff of romance novels, she thought as she walked. Perhaps she should write one. Her relationship with Chris had all the ingredients of a good romance. Attraction at first sight, drama, intrigue, conflict, and then the resolution with a couple living happily ever after. Or so she hoped. Jan stopped and changed the shopping bag from one hand to the other. Being pregnant was slowing her down. She could have brought the car, but she felt she should walk to keep fit, and it gave her the chance to get to know others. Even Bill Smith recognized her on a good day, and had once allowed her to take him home when she'd found him wandering in the wrong direction. "If you go down there, you'll end up in the woods," she told him. "Ooh, mustn't do that," he said, pulling a face. "I might get eaten by the dogs there." Jan hadn't disagreed. It was now common knowledge in Merrillis that Anne Long, the midwife, lived in Ivy Cottage and allowed her dogs to run in the woods when there was no one around. The villagers didn't object, even though they knew she wasn't supposed to let them off their leads, and she'd already received a warning from the police. But no one would tell, as their presence helped keep the vandals out of the woods. 10 minutes later, Jan paused again to swap over the bag and then continued home. Chris was already in, having taken time off work so he could be with her for the hospital appointment. "You should have phoned me," he said, concerned, taking the heavy shopping bag from her. "I could have collected you." "I'm fine. There's no need to fuss." "But I want to fuss and look after you," he said, kissing her. "I know, and if I'm honest, I like it," Jan laughed. "Good. Today's the day we find out if it's a boy or a girl," Chris said, unable to hide his excitement. "Yes, it is," Jan replied. She played down the other reason for the scan, that the baby wasn't developing properly. Chris was anxious anyway after what had happened to him and Camille, but there was no chance of that happening again, as Chris and she didn't share the same DNA. She'd told him, as she'd told Lillian, that she must have got her dates wrong. This scan would hopefully confirm that, so there was no point in worrying Chris.